and we have automatic withholding. For a population also dealing with runaway inflation, the new tax was a disaster. What money they had was virtually worthless, and nowhere near enough to cover the patently absurd demands that were now being laid down from on high. So every 4 years, the citizens of the empire would have a collective panic attack as they tried to figure out how in the hell they were going to pay the tax collectors. And of course, since the tax collectors themselves were on the hook if they did not meet their quota for revenue, well, let's just say that exceptions were never made, and eventually Constantine had to step in and publish edicts banning the more sadistic forms of torture. It was not at all uncommon during this quadrennial nightmare for children to be sold into slavery to pay tax debts, or for households to simply give up and become indentured servants to wealthy landowners when they were unable to pay. Constantine was not indifferent to the problems of his new tax system, and over the years he did his best to make sure tax obligations lined up with the citizens' actual ability to pay. But the long and short of it was that he needed the money, and sometimes you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. So, what was the omelet Constantine was trying to make? That is, why did he need all of that money? The emperor, of course, had an army to pay for, and frontiers to defend, which we'll talk about more next time. He also had a bureaucracy to pay for and a government to run. He also had initiated an empire-wide building program that was unprecedented in its size and scope, at least in the context of its time. And that building program, though dominated by church construction, St. Peter's, for example, was a hugely expensive undertaking. Constantine did not ignore the secular infrastructure, and he did his best to help cash-strapped municipalities keep their public buildings from falling into disrepair. And of course, there was the city he was building on the Bosphorus, which was officially inaugurated, but which remained a persistent drain on the treasury as the emperor got his city up and running. All of this added up to a very large number on the bottom line, and it is actually much to Constantine's credit that he was at least mindful of the fact that at the end of the day, the credits and debits ought to line up. Tax and spend might be bad, but tax cut and spend is even worse. Plus, while Constantine could never be accused of being frugal, neither could he be accused of being mindlessly extravagant. Everything he did had a point, and for the most part, that which Constantine paid for was well worth the cost. That said, his handling of the economy, and his monetary policy in particular, inflamed problems that would, in time, lead to nothing less than the fall of the Western Empire. For example, one of the most interesting side effects of the commercial tax was that large landowners were able to avoid paying it simply by making their estates as self-sufficient as possible. No trade, no tax. Along with a number of other factors, this increased self-sufficiently allowed the super elites to begin withdrawing from public life altogether, undermining the imperial system, and creating little independent fiefdoms that would in time form the backbone of feudal Europe. And that's the problem with these things. Sometimes you don't know what the final cost is going to be. Next time, we will cover the last years of the man history will come to know as Constantine the Great. With his heir apparent Crispus now dead, the aging emperor will have to quickly bring his younger sons up to speed so that the empire would not be left in the hands of novices when he was gone. Pressures in the north will plunge him and the empire back into war, and a crisis in the east will very nearly lead to armed conflict with the Persians. And of course, at the very end, and with no time left for any further sin to stain his soul, Constantine, the first Christian emperor, will finally be baptized. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 80,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book download. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all your future audiobook purchases. This week, I am going to go with an entry from the Annals of Greek History, The March of the 10,000 by Xenophon, recommended by listener Claude. It is the harrowing tale of 10,000 Greek mercenaries trying to fight their way back home after being left stranded in the middle of Persia after finding themselves on the losing side of a dynastic war. Written by one of the 10,000's leaders, it is one of the few historical accounts we have from the ancient world actually written by an active participant in the events he is describing. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 139, Wash Away Your Sins. Last time, we talked about what Constantine got up to when he wasn't busy trying to convert the empire to Christianity. You'll recall that for the most part he was up to refining the administrative apparatus Diocletian had created, transforming Byzantium into Constantinople, and, killing his wife and son. This week, we will bring the long and remarkable career of the first Christian emperor to a close. But before we do, I want to spend some time discussing the external posture of the empire during Constantine's reign. Last time, we focused mostly on domestic concerns, taxes and monetary policy and so on, so this week I want to take a look at foreign affairs. What was Constantine's relationship with the tribes beyond the northern frontiers? What was his relationship with the great Sassanid Empire beyond the eastern frontiers? And of course, what was his relationship with the army that defended those frontiers? Once we get done talking about all that, we're going to turn our attention to the thorny issue of succession, and then finally, to the baptism and death of Constantine the Great. As we've discussed previously, during the later Roman Empire, the hard line separating the civilized Romans from the barbarian tribes began to blur. Imperial policy had always hinted at the possible benefits of bringing the Germans into the Roman fold, and round about the reign of Aurelian, that hint became a blunt statement, as willing tribesmen, suitably pacified, started to be deposited in Gaul, or Pannonia, or Moesia, to help fill the empty quarters and provide a buffer between the soft inner empire and the hard northern wilds. These same tribesmen were then recruited into the army, and by virtue of the fact that the legions were a far more merit-based institution in the late empire than it was in the early empire, they began to climb up the chain of command. This so-called Germanization of the army is a very important development in the history of the empire, a development which we will come back to again and again as the West slips into terminal decline. Because any discussion of why the Western Empire fell would be incomplete without a good hard look at the Roman failure to successfully integrate the Germans the way they had successfully integrated practically every other foreign people they had run up against in the whole long history of the empire. By virtue of the circumstances of his times, and the circumstances of his own political situation, Constantine wound up becoming an acolyte of Germanization. His father is fighting wars with and making peace with the tribes along the Rhine River. So when Constantine succeeded him, the son inherited the political and military legacies of the father. Constantius had embraced the policy of German settlement within the borders, and in particular, he had a strong relationship with the Franks on the Lower Rhine. Indeed, one of the great successes of his career was defeating a portion of the Franks who were aligned with Carausius and then flipping them over to his side. When Constantius died 10 years later and Constantine made his bid for power, he was backed at a critical moment by the Frankish clients his father had cultivated. From that moment on, Constantine had a close relationship with the Germans in general, and the Franks in particular. They formed the most formidable parts of the armies he used to conquer the empire, and his own personal bodyguard was made up exclusively of German cavalry. This is of course not to say that the Germans were one monolithic thing, and that Constantine was friendly with them all, nor that they were all friendly with him. One look at the innumerable campaigns fought along the Rhine during the length of Constantine's career is enough to dispense with that notion. But that said, the incorporation of Germanic elements into the empire's military apparatus was now on the steady rise, and Constantine was a big reason why. Besides his willingness to fight using German soldiers, there was one other change Constantine made to the military structure that wound up having long-term consequences for the empire. You'll recall that back in episode 125, The Best Defense is a Good Defense, I mentioned the difficulty in trying to figure which of the period's military reform were actually initiated by Diocletian due to the presence of possible anachronisms in the historical record. Specifically, I was talking about the creation of the Limitanii, the frontier militias who would act as a first line of defense until the legions proper could arrive on the scene. Well, we can stop worrying about anachronisms now, because in the reign of Constantine, the existence of the Limitanii is definitely attested to, and those who are loath to attribute the creation of it to Diocletian are hesitant to do so because they believe it was actually Constantine who initiated the change, and that he did so as a way to make up for the fact that he was now deploying the empire's legionary forces much further behind the frontier lines. He is said to have done this in order to create large mobile field armies that would be able to easily reach an invasion point along the border and then overwhelm any hostile forces they found. But these days, there is a large contingent of historians who suspect that Constantine concentrated his forces and garrisoned them in interior cities for domestic political reasons. More than any commander since perhaps Octavian, Constantine's career was dominated by civil war, and it is not unreasonable to assume that his military posture was heavily influenced by that experience. To help him run the vast new army he now had sole control of, an army numbering somewhere between 400 and 600,000 men, Constantine created two new ranks, the Master of the Infantry and, resurrecting the long-ago abandoned title of a dictator's second-in-command, the Master of the Horse. As the title suggests, one was supposed to be in control of the Empire's foot soldiers, and the other in charge of the Empire's cavalry, thus allowing for large-scale coordination without investing either man with sole control over all the forces in a region. But in practice, both of these high-ranking officers wound up commanding elements of the other's administrative sphere. Plus, in time, both of these ranks would become subservient to an overall master of the military, who acted as the commander-in-chief of the whole army, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of the foot-horse distinction. In and of themselves, these new positions are not that interesting, as they simply fill the void left by the Praetorian prefects once their military powers were stripped away. But the role the men who held these offices would play in the final century and a half of the Western Empire is fascinating indeed. Essentially, denied the right to hold political power in their own right, the powerful German officers who served as masters of the military in the 5th century would become the power behind a series of puppet emperors. And eventually, the imperial office itself would be weakened to the point that when it was abolished by Odoacer in 476, it went not with a bang, but a whimper. But we'll get to all of that soon enough.